Okay. What chapters? What did we cover the third trip in, Judy? Do you remember? The third trip. What chapters were the third journey in? Remember anybody? Michael, you memorized this when you were in the teenage class. Third journey. Which chapters? They ended in 21. 19, 20, and 21 was Paul's third journey. His trip is done, goes the rhyme. And at the end of that, he's in Jerusalem. And he decides that he's been convinced that he should try to appease some of the Jews by helping some other men complete a vow. He pays their expenses in the temple. And he is arrested, and they almost beat him to death in the process. Acts 22, he retells the story of why he is doing these things that he's doing. Acts 22 and 9. It's a retelling of the road to Damascus. So in Acts 23, we find out that he has a bunch of people that are ready to kill him. 40 that weren't going to eat until they killed him. They weren't going to drink until they killed him. And so the soldiers, how many hundreds? 400 something soldiers escorted him out of town on horseback, or he had some kind of animal. We don't know for sure. Horseback. They were on horseback. And they end up taking him all the way to where? Caesarea. Thank you. So that's Acts 23. Soldiers and Paul flee. We end up going through most of 24, where he's standing there being tried. They bring in an attorney. They bring in Ananias, the high priest, and they accuse him again. And down, we ended up getting down about verse 24. He's in front of Felix, and Felix is just going to hold on to him for a while. Well, we covered a lot about the resurrection. In fact, about how important the resurrection was, why it's a recurrent topic. Sadducees didn't believe in it. It's very necessary for us. I read a number of verses and ironically left out the one that I intended to emphasize in 1 Corinthians 15. I made a list and then realized that was the one I wanted to emphasize, but then I decided to go back through the Old Testament first, and then I forgot it altogether. But essentially, if you go over to 1 Corinthians 15, let's do that together. Why is it important to us? Why has it come back so many times? Well, Paul writes about this again. Down in verse 11, chapter 15, whether then it was I or they, so we preach and so you believed. Now, if Christ is preached that he has been raised from the dead, how do some among you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? But if there is no resurrection of the dead, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith also is in vain. And he goes on, and if you could read that whole page there in front of you down about verse 24, and then it starts again really strongly over in, about verse 51. Behold, I tell you a mystery, we will not all sleep, but we will all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. For this perishable must put on the imperishable, and this mortal must put on immortality. But when this perishable will have put on the imperishable, and this mortal will have put on immortality, then will come about the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? So over and over, Paul, even in his writing, comes back to the resurrection is important. And we're going to see in a little while, he mentions that again. It's important. It's not just a divisive issue that he uses to distract people, right? It's important and the crux of a lot of what's going on here. But that all happened in the last class. So down at verse 24, he's been held, chapter 24 of Acts, verse 24. But some days later, Felix arrived with Drusilla, his wife, who was a Jewess, and sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. And verse 25. But as he was discussing righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix became frightened and said, go away for the present, and when I find time, I will summon you. I could see why he would be frightened. He was not a moral person. He and Drusilla were not moral people. They were not under self-control. They were facing judgment. And so he puts an end to this. But also verse 26, it says, at the same time too,
He was hoping that money would be given him by Paul. Therefore, he also used to send for him quite often and converse with him. But it doesn't seem very sincere at that point, right, the way that's phrased. So everyone we've studied has a reaction to the gospel. Felix's reaction to the gospel was, well, I'll continue to hear, but mostly just because I'm indulging you, hoping that I'm going to have a financial reward after that. Verse 27. It's one of the saddest sentences to me. So you converses with him, and then it says, but after 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and wishing to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. So here's Paul. 2 years, at least 2 years had passed. And nobody credits Paul during this time with writing any of the letters that we see in the New Testament. I've mentioned a number of times when someone thought a letter might have been written during this time or other times. In this case, though, there are a number of people that think it's 2 years that, what did Luke was with Paul, right, a lot of this time. What other thing did Luke write other than Acts? Wrote Luke, right? Well, there's a lot of research involved with that. There's a lot of time involved with that. So some people think that maybe this 2 years was spent somewhat with Paul and with Luke writing the book of Luke because it fits in here. Maybe that's true, I don't know, but that's what some people think. So Felix has left Paul in prison. Chapter 25. Festus then, having arrived in the province, 3 days later went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. Now, this is about AD 60. Festus only rules for about 2 years total. So they can kind of know about when this happened. He was actually in prison himself a little bit and had been released, had some amount of power. There's all these politics going on. And so some of what he is involved with here, he knows how long politics and things can take in Rome. So as we read this story about appealing to Caesar and whatnot, it's interesting. He's freshly a politician here in charge and having to deal with some things, but he knows that things move slowly sometimes in Rome. Verse 2. So he's there 3 days later and went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. And the chief priests and the leading men of the Jews brought charges against Paul, and they were urging him, meaning they were urging Festus, requesting a concession against Paul that he might have him brought to Jerusalem, at the same time setting an ambush to kill him on the way. So same playbook. Let's get him out in the open, and maybe we can murder him on the way. Festus then answered that Paul was being kept in custody at Caesarea and that he himself was about to leave Jerusalem shortly, go back to Caesarea. Verse 5, therefore he said, let the influential men among you go there with me, and if there is anything wrong about the man, let them prosecute him. Verse 6, and after he spent not more than 8 or 10 days among them, he went down to Caesarea. Now we realize that's not north, south, east, west, right? That's down the topographically down to Caesarea. And on the next day, he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. So, one of his early tasks, he's been put in charge there to represent Rome, and he goes down to Jerusalem because that's where the problems always come from, Jerusalem, right there. That's why they have all of the soldiers stationed there at the Tower of Antonius, because there's always problems in Jerusalem. But he rules from Caesarea. So he goes down there to interview these people. They all want him to bring Paul down there. But it's interesting what he says, though, that in verse 5, if there's anything wrong about the man, let them prosecute him, meaning up in Caesarea, down in Caesarea, but north in Caesarea. But then as we go along, you'll see here in verse 6, he takes his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. The tribunal is a judgment seat. It's basically a ruling, like a throne, you might say, but just a judgment seat saying, from here is where I'm going to make my edicts or my decisions. And ordered Paul to be brought. After Paul arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, in verse 7, bringing many and serious charges against him, which they could not prove. Very clear there. Verse 8, while Paul said in his own defense, I have committed no offense either against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against Caesar. Verse 9, but Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me on these charges? And then that's when Paul reacts about where he's going to be, and we'll talk about that. Does any of that seem confusing? It does kind of to me. He tells them in Jerusalem, if you want to come up, we'll try him up there in Caesarea. He gets on the judgment seat and the tribunal, and they give their evidence. Paul gives some evidence, and then he could have said, let's see, in verse 9, it says, but Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial? But he could have said, oh, I'm not hearing any evidence that says anything more. We've just tried him. That was it. It's over. But instead, he's really trying to appease them. But I don't get the impression here that he knew they were trying to murder Paul on the way, assassinate him. But it's interesting to me, a little confusing to me, that he does say, are you willing to stand trial before me on these charges back down in Jerusalem? So anyway, it's a little bit of double jeopardy, you might say. But Paul said in 10, I am standing before Caesar's tribunal where I ought to be tried. I have done no wrong to the Jews, as you also very well know. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything worthy of death, I do not refuse to die. But if none of those things is true of which these men accuse me, no one can hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. Verse 12. Then when Festus had conferred with his council, his own Festus's council, not the council there from Jerusalem, right? When he had conferred with his council, he answered, you have appealed to Caesar you shall go. Did Festus have a choice in that? No. Paul's a Roman citizen. He's appealed to Caesar. He didn't seem like he had much choice. That's literally what this was for, that if you were getting an unfair trial and you wanted to go get an actual trial in Rome, you can do that. Is it guaranteed to be quick? No, it's not guaranteed to be quick, but it's supposed to be more fair. Who was Caesar at this time? Anybody know? It's kind of scary to think about for me. It's Nero, okay? Nero, before he went completely insane, right? His first 4 or 5 years, he was young. He was under a lot of instructors, those kind of things. And this is during that time, supposedly. And so, but the idea was I could go there and get a fair trial. And when it says that he Festus conferred with his council, I'm sure when he said, hey, I'm kind of new doing this. What's going on here? Do I have any leeway? And they basically said, nope, you don't have any leeway now. And that plays out as we go along. Verse 13. Now when several days had elapsed, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and paid their respects to Festus. Okay, and this is going to bring us to something that I want to show you. Herods. You get confused with all the Herods in the Bible. I do. I do. So basically you've got Herod the Great. He's at the top up there, and all these folks in one way or another are in charge during their life because of him. He's the one from Luke 1 and 2. He's the one from Matthew 2 that is going to kill all the babies when Jesus is being born, or after Jesus was born. And you also notice it's kind of funny. He died in 4 BC, which is kind of, we always think about, 0 was the date. That's not really how all the dates work then. But that's Herod the Great. And then when you get down to Herod Antipas, that's over there on the left. Those are not in order of age, by the way. But all those 4 sons were sons of his. And Herod Antipas is every gospel Herod reference except those 2 that are mentioned. Meaning, he's the one that tried and killed, but he killed John the Baptist, right? With his wife, was it Herodias? Is that right? She asked for his head and got it. That's Herod Antipas. And also, he's the one that met with Christ and then sent him back to Pilate as well. Same Herod, okay? But then he doesn't have the lineage. It's not like all these guys are related to him anymore after that, all right? You got Herod Agrippa 1, and, I said Herodias on Antipas. Hold on a second here. That'd be very confusing. Married Herodias. Herod Antipas married Herodias, who's the wife of the half-brother Philip. Okay, so Aristobulus, his son was Herod Agrippa I, his daughter was Herodias. they end up in a relationship, but she was Philip's wife originally. So it's, you don't want to live like these folks, right? It's bad. But Aristobulus was not ever the king. He was not the Herod, okay? So it jumps to his offspring, Herod Agrippa I and Herodias. Everything we've read in Acts so far that says the word Herod is pretty much this Herod, right? So who killed James and released Peter? Herod Agrippa I, okay? And he just goes by Herod most of the time in Acts. And what's funny is Herod Agrippa II, that's who we just met. Herod Agrippa II, it says that, let's see, verse 13, when several days had elapsed, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived. Agrippa, well, it's actually Herod Agrippa II. They just nicknamed it Herod Agrippa. And so in Acts, all the references except 4:27 and 13:1, which is just kind of a historical thing, that's Herod Agrippa I. And then every time it says Agrippa, that's Herod Agrippa II. So that's probably clear as mud at this point. But I mention it because Herod Agrippa II, Bernice, and Drusilla, those are all siblings, or half-siblings, okay? So when you've got Herod Agrippa II and Bernice come down here, they are brothers and sisters living in an incestuous relationship. And they're visiting Drusilla, right, who was there with Festus. Was Festus with Felix, who had been there. That's Bernice's and Herod's sister. Does that make sense? I've got some of these if you want to ever look at it. But so every time now we're talking about Agrippa, that's Herod Agrippa II. Clear as mud. I'm looking at it. You guys are like, Matt, you're crazy. You should not be doing this. Okay. Anyway, so a few of these other people are mentioned, you can see in the Bible, but they just don't have a central. They're not a central figure of some kind making decisions. So let's go back over there to verse 13 in chapter 25. Now, when several days had elapsed, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and paid their respects to Festus. While they were spending many days there, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There is a man who was left as a prisoner by Felix. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I answered them that it is not the custom of the Romans to hand over any man before the accused meets his accusers face to face and has an opportunity to make his defense against the charges." So, verse 17, after they assembled here, I did not delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought before me. Now, on the left-hand side of my Bible margin, I've got verse 6 written there, because if you look up at verse 6, he had spent about 8 or 10 days down there in Jerusalem. He went up to Caesarea, and it says on the next day he took a seat on the tribunal. That's what this says. I did not delay, but on the next day when I found out about this, I took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought before me. Verse 18. When the accusers stood up, they began bringing charges against him, not of such crimes as I was expecting, but they simply had some points of disagreement with him about their own religion and about a dead man, Jesus, whom Paul asserted to be alive. He'd been resurrected, right? I've got verse 7 written down next to those two because that's what it says. In verse 7, they came down from Jerusalem, stood around and bringing many and serious charges, which they could not prove. All right, back over to verse 20, Acts 25:20. Being at a loss how to investigate such matters, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there stand trial on these matters. But when Paul appealed to be held in custody for the emperor's decision, I ordered him to be kept in custody until I sent him to Caesar. He's talking to the Agrippa here. So this is something like 25, 30 years after Jesus had been crucified. You can tell Festus's naivete a little bit here. This man, he didn't know anything about this. He is not from there. He's been sent here from Rome to rule. But who's he talking to? He's talking to Herod Agrippa II, Herod, okay? So Herod's father was the one, Herod Agrippa II, his father was the one that killed James and released Peter, okay? His sister, Bernice, Drusilla, they were alive during that time, okay? So they had been living in this area. They knew a lot about these events. Herod Agrippa's uncle was the one that killed Christ, right? Did I say that right? Yes. He's the one that actually killed Christ, this man, Christ. And Herod Agrippa II's grandfather, Herod the Great, he's the one that tried to kill him because of all the prophecies that existed, that they'd all been looking for the Messiah this whole time. He tried to stop it sometime shortly after Jesus was born, as we read in Luke 2. And so now Festus doesn't know what he's talking about, but he's talking to somebody that does. And it's a couple of words here. I like talking about some of the words. The emperor's decision. Is that what yours says, verse 21? You say emperor? Does anybody say anything other than emperor there? Emperor's decision, yeah. Augustus's. It's a strange word. They get that from the Caesar Augustus, that first one was brought them all the power and notoriety. It's not actually the word emperor, it's the word Augustus. And it's kind of like they use it in the way you might say His Majesty, right? Does that make sense? That you might say His Majesty. That's just this way of capturing this thing, this bigger thing that is. They don't really use the word emperor. It's just sort of funny. Augustus's, the Augustus. And so that was in verse 21. I ordered him to be kept in custody until I send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Felix, I also would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, Festus said, you shall hear him. I think I've said it a bunch of times in this class. I don't speak Greek. I don't know Greek. I don't know the Koine Greek. But the way that's phrased, apparently, it might have been a little more complicated to say that he'd been thinking somewhat about this already. He'd like to do this, meaning firsthand, that he's heard these accounts, he's heard about Paul, he's wondered about these things, but he's never heard it firsthand, which is interesting because Festus has really never heard about this stuff firsthand except from Paul, right? That he's hearing it secondhand mostly from people making these false accusations. He wants to hear from Paul himself. So tomorrow, he said, you shall hear him. So on the next day, verse 23, when Agrippa came together with Bernice amid great pomp and entered the auditorium accompanied by the commanders and the prominent men of the city, at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. And this is a big deal. Okay, so there's a word there, commanders. Does your Bible have something written as that word, commanders? I mispronounce this word a lot, but chiliarchs? Chiliarchs, is that what yours says? Okay. Chief captains? Okay, a centurion, how many people do they have under them? 100. A chiliarch, how many people do they have under them? 1,000. 1,000 soldiers, okay? So that's these chief captains. It's interesting that when they talk about accompanied by the commanders and the prominent men of the city, we're talking about when they're talking about pomp, this is a big deal. They're all coming in. King Agrippa is there. Is King Agrippa II really a king like we think about? By the way, like what's he king of exactly? The kingdoms have been all split up. Rome's in charge, but it's still this nobility sort of a title that he's given. But he's there. But let's look over at Matthew 10 and see if this was a surprise. Matthew 10, verse 17 to 20. Let's see what Christ had said to his apostles, what was going to happen. Matthew 10, verse 17. But be aware of men, for they will hand you over to the courts and scourge you in their synagogues, and you will even be brought before governors and kings for my sake as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles. And then these verses that we've quoted in here many times. I don't know that I've read them, but we've referenced them. But when they hand you over, do not worry about how or what you are to say, for it will be given you in that hour what you are to say. For it is not you who speak, but it is the Spirit of your Father who speaks in you. So who's here? You've got governors, you've got kings, you've got he stands, in fact, what was the word here? They're going to hand you over to the courts. That's exactly what has happened to Paul. And then look over at Acts 9:15, which we read earlier in this class for sure. Acts 9:15. But the Lord, he's talking to Ananias. But the Lord said to him, Ananias, go, for he, Paul, is a chosen instrument of mine to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and sons of Israel, and the sons of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake. So here he is in front of King Agrippa, getting ready to be brought in, fulfilling what Christ had said about the apostles, fulfilling what God had told Ananias back in Acts 9, and here he is. Festus said, verse 24, King Agrippa, and all you gentlemen here present with us, you see this man about whom all the people of the Jews appealed to me, both at Jerusalem and here, loudly declaring that he ought not to live any longer. But I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, so I let him go. No, he goes on. Nothing worthy of death, and since he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to send him. Yet I have nothing definite about him to write to my Lord, meaning the Nero up there, right? Therefore I have brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the invitation has taken place, I may have something to write. For it seems absurd to me in sending the prisoner not to indicate also the charges against him. I have a little word at the end of that says 2 words, the irony, right? I think it's absurd to send someone for a trial with no charges, so we're still looking for some charges. It's so strange. And but it gives Paul's opportunity. It's interesting, Paul took the opportunity at the temple to speak in front of the mob that just killed him, and now he's getting an opportunity to speak in front of these distinguished people, what was the name of the commanders, the chiliarchs, and the King Agrippa, Herod Agrippa II. At this point now, it was kind of the introduction of Festus, and now Agrippa is evidently in charge. Agrippa said, chapter 26, Agrippa said to Paul, you are permitted to speak for yourself. Then Paul stretched out his hand and proceeded to make his defense. Here's the defense. In regard to all things of which I am accused by the Jews, I consider myself fortunate, King Agrippa, that I am about to make my defense before you today, especially because you are an expert in all customs and questions among the Jews. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently. The word patiently, I'm not going to be brief this time, right? It's very brief over there in chapter 25. We don't hear much of a defense. But he's also talking in front of someone who doesn't know much about the history of Jews. Now he's saying, I beg you to listen to me patiently. And it does seem like Herod, by the way, does as we read this. It seems like Festus still wasn't particularly patient, but we'll see that as it comes. Not any really particular flattery here. This is truthful. Herod Agrippa II is familiar with the Jewish customs and should be. So then, verse 4, all Jews know my manner of life from my youth up, which from the beginning was spent among my own nation and at Jerusalem. Since they have all known about me for a long time, if they are willing to testify that I lived as a Pharisee according to the strictest set of our religion. So, that's proof of itself that he was devout, right? He was a Pharisee. He grew up as a Pharisee. We know under Gamaliel, right? And Herod would understand, okay, this proves itself. Unless someone was going to stand up and say, no, he was never trained as a Pharisee. Then he doesn't have to say more than that about saying, I was a devout Jew. You see how that works there as far as presenting evidence. And verse 6. Alan's so nice. He's like, 6. Thank you. So he has the religious heritage there to present as evidence. Verse 6. And now I am standing trial for the hope of the promise made by God to our fathers. Which promise? We're going to have a Messiah. The Messiah is going to save our people, and there's going to be resurrection from the dead, right? I'm religious. I was raised that way, and now I'm literally on trial for simply saying that all the stuff that was supposed to come true, that we've always heard about, that we were trained is going to come true, now because I said it came true, I'm on trial. He didn't say this up. It's verse 7. Let's see. So the hope of the promise made by God to our fathers, verse 7, the promise to which our 12 tribes hope to attain as they earnestly serve God day and night. And for this hope, O king, I am being accused by Jews. Verse 8, why is it considered incredible among you people if God does raise the dead? That's the crux of it. We've been told God's going to raise the dead. I was raised as a child. God's going to raise the dead. And now I am on trial over and over and over again because I'm saying that it has come true and that we should believe in God. And now people hate me because I actually believe that God told us the truth. Verse 9. So then, I thought to myself that I had to do many things hostile to the name of Jesus of Nazareth. And this is just what I did in Jerusalem. Not only did I lock up many of the saints in prisons, having received authority from the chief priests, but also when they were being put to death, I cast my vote against them. I think that's the strongest language that Paul has used to date about his parts in some of that. When he talks about he held Stephen's coats. I think we went through this and mentioned it in our study together, but he cast his vote to sentence Christians to death. And I can't imagine how conflicted one must be, even though he has a guilty conscience. He did it out of being devout, being faithful in what he thought was right, and yet it was completely wrong. And you also wonder how many of these people, these Christians that he then interacted with for the next decades were related to some of those folks that he had put to death. And it's a hard thing to get one's mind around. And I punished, at verse 11, and as I punished them often in all the synagogues, I tried to force them to blaspheme. And being furiously engaged at them, I kept pursuing them even to foreign cities. While so engaged as I was journeying to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priests, at midday, O king, I saw on the way a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, shining all around me and those who were journeying with me. And when we had fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew dialect, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. And I said, who are you, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But get up and stand on your feet. For this purpose I have appeared to you, to appoint you a minister and a witness, not only to the things which you have seen, but also to the things in which I will appear to you, rescuing you from the Jewish people and from the Gentiles to whom I am sending you. And then this big verse, verse 18, to open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light, and from the dominion of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who have been sanctified by faith in me. And he's getting ready to wrap it up. We're going to talk about this starting Sunday and go from there, but we've only got a couple minutes. Does anybody have anything they want to add? Yes, ma'am.
I was thinking as you were reading this section about, you say, oh, I had authority and commission from the chief priests. Like, essentially, their golden child totally flipped the script. And some of this reaction has got to be desperation and embarrassment, and we've got to control the crazy that just got unleashed out of our control.
Yeah, it's interesting. Thank you for speaking loudly for everybody to hear. It's interesting that it doesn't say it, but I can't imagine how mad they would be personally at him for abandoning them and taking this whole other side. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah.
Over here saying, you guys got it all wrong, and
Yeah.
they're just furious.
Yeah, it's interesting. Anybody else? Well, okay. Keep reading. So, open their eyes, they may turn from darkness to light. What is that? What do we call that? Revelation. He gets a revelation from God, a direct meeting with Christ, and he says that they need to turn from darkness to the light. What do we call that? They need to repent. They need to repent. That open their eyes so that they repent and escape the dominion of Satan and turn to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who have been sanctified by faith. So repent so you can receive forgiveness of sins in order to get your permanent inheritance, your resurrection. Okay, and we'll come back to that on Sunday. Thank you very much for your time.